Yeah. So the whole point and the whole premise of this video entirely is just to make sure people have better arguments for the positions they're going under. Well, the more they debate. So to start off with, and the main one I'm mainly going to be talking about in this video is just like low tier sort of arguments you could use for abortion, right? For and against, like whether or not abortion is moral, and then you could use those so that every single time I debate someone, every single time I see someone debate, it's not always like, oh well, they're recycling or they're using the same really bad arguments. At least these ones, even though they might be really bad, they might still be, good enough to separate you from the rest of your peers and the rest of the low tiers who are around you. And the first one to start off with is just, if you want to argue for pro-life, there are a few arguments you could go for. You could go for the fact that like one, again, and you noticed like what's it called, TikTok debaters aren't really able to like get a firm grasp of this. So one, all you need to do is just claim that oh yeah, the fetus has potential, you morally value potential. Now typically like also called, and people typically morally value potential, and typically like the sort of response there is just like, okay, well, prove, or why should I value potential? And it's like, oh well, that's sort of a meta-ethical question. It's like, okay, well, I can't really explain to you why you should value. There's not some form of objective standard I can appeal to which proves that you should value it. Rather, it's just something that's consistent with humans' behavior. So then you'd also now need a principal distinction whenever people value potential in one case, right, compared to the other case. And this is an argument that I like using because it's just really simple and really easy to argue. So the examples of like people valuing potential you could use is like, oh well, take an example of there's a future generation that are going to come into existence, and the chance of that future generation coming into existence is about the same chance of like all things being equal, a mother having a baby after like being impregnated by a guy, right? And baby actually coming out all right, no disabilities, none of that, right? So the potential is the same, and then you decide before they even begin to develop, so they are even fetuses, yeah, you just know that they're going to come, there's like a high probability of them coming into existence, but you just like they are even fetuses, yeah. Then you see somebody like coming around and like start destroying the environment on their deathbed. They've like, oh yeah, no, there's no reason for me to care about the earth, da 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 da. Now typically we'd label these type of people bad people. You say, oh well, don't destroy the planet for the sake of the future generation. And it's sort of like you could use those sort of analogies to explain that, oh yeah, well, even on some low level we do actually extend more value onto the future generation, and we do actually extend more value onto their potential, right? Even also called extend more value onto their potential, even if you might even if the more value you assign to them may be less than what you'd give to actual people, you still do assign more value onto them. Now this sort of gets into a weird sort of like argument of like, well, is an action moral if it preserves more of what we value, or if it's an action moral if it favors the thing which we have more value towards, or is an action moral just if it preserves everything we morally value, or is an action moral if it like aligns with some sort of like principles you have which do not actually justify an action by virtue of its consequences. It goes into a whole consequentialist versus utilitarian debate, and or like consequentialist versus like I don't know why I said the utilitarian. I mean consequentialist versus like deontology debate. Well, like again, I've more so favor the sort of side of like deontology. I think like generally my intuitions just seem to support deontology more, and like the sort of motivations I give for that is like there are certain sort of actions like say grape or say like murder, like those are the sort of actions which I don't think they would be okay to do under any sort of scenario, no matter the sort of consequences that you have. And it's like some people, they might be fine with committing themselves to the view that it would be okay. Like there's some circumstances where rape and murder would be okay, but it's like, well, those aren't the type of like views I won't commit myself to. I don't want to commit myself to a view where like those sort of like heinous activities are like justified in some context. So I'm also leaning towards deontology. That's like a brief outline of why I would like why my intuitions favor that side. I know there's like a more complex arguments that I have to favor it, but it's just like that's just a brief overview. And then what's it called? You can use potential arguments. You can also use future like ours arguments. You can say like, oh wow, what's it called? This fetus, blah blah blah. This fetus, all things being equal, they would have like unique experiences, right? Or unique positive experiences, right? And we value these unique positive experiences that like sentient creatures might have, or sentient creatures will have. So any sort of privation which stops these things from having these future like positive experiences, we say that ASMR. It's like I'm not exactly grasping the argument. I'm probably sure I could, if I put my mind to it, I can pull up the PDF right now and like show it to people if they want to like look at it. But actually no, in fact I will, because look, it's kind of getting tiring looking at people trying to debate the pro-choice position. Like I go on TikTok, I see people debating the pro-life position, and then they're sort of getting beat up by random low-level pro-choicers, or they're getting beat up by random other debaters. And it's sort of like debating on TikTok was sort of the thing which revived the community in the first place, or like built it to where it was in the first place. So hopefully, if people are more so like recognized as being intelligent on TikTok, because the main thing those guys usually debate is abortion. It's like if they're mainly recognized as being even like above average in terms of intelligence when they're debating abortion, then there probably might be a like increasing amount of debaters who come to the community. But give me a second, let me pull up the PDF. I forgot my keybind to pause recordings. No. Woe is me. But I don't really understand this. Like usually, and this is a sort of other thing which is not really too connected with the point I'm talking about, or like the arguments for and against abortion. But usually, if you want to talk about abortion, or you want to talk about like applied ethical topics, typically what you need to be going for is a consistent system, and b, one which aligns with more people's intuitions than others. So like upon rationally reflection on, oh wow, my goodness, my speech, or upon rationally reflecting on the sort of entailments that agreeing to certain views would have, you like depending on what sort of intuitions you have, you may choose to side with one view over the other. Who knows, right? So it's like you want to have the sort of view where it doesn't actually commit you to any sort of absurdities, even upon rational reflection. So say like grape, for example, right? It's like, well, your view probably doesn't want you to or doesn't want to commit you to certain sort of views, like under, like, let's say you're a utilitarian, right? Your view probably shouldn't commit you to like grape being okay, even if like in under the situation where it didn't maximize utility. Or say like there are these other like crazy situations, like you basically just don't want to agree to stuff that's like obviously trivially absurd, right? And it's sort of like what may be absurd may differ between people, right? At least usually, but there are certain sorts of things which like almost universally we agree is like morally wrong. So take like burning innocent children to death, right? It's like obviously everyone can agree that burning innocent children to death without like any sort of reason is morally wrong, right? So then we can just analyze the sort of traits that doing that action has, which causes us to have these certain beliefs. And then we may say, oh well, what's it called, these other actions, all of these other actions share these traits as well. So hey, what's it called, all of these group of actions which share this specific trait may be wrong. I don't really know. I'm not too clear on how people's like psychology works whenever they're determining like what action is right or wrong, but that's at least how I assume they do it. But it's like your view probably doesn't want you to commit you to views which you can just reflect and see that, oh well, this sort of has a whole bunch of entailments that intuitively I wouldn't agree to. And of course there's always going to be a whole bunch of people who are like, okay, well, what's it called, I don't care about your intuition, why should I care about your intuition? And it's sort of like, okay, yeah, well, if you don't care about my intuition, right, and all you want, and the only sort of values you have is having a consistent standard, then it's like, sure, you can be consistent. Like I know people who can be perfectly consistent whenever they want to say that like killing innocent babies is moral, right? They can just be like, or for example, they can just only care about what brings about the most negative experiences to other people. So, and then they can have a perfectly consistent system which supports that, right? And it's like, okay, well, you can have perfectly consistent systems for everything. So does that mean nobody can win any applied ethics debate ever? And it's sort of like, well, obviously not, right? But again, while I'm at it, let me pull up this paper because I've been playing it off. I don't know why I've been playing it off, but I've been playing it off because I'm too focused on this game. So let me pull up. Okay, so my keybind for pausing recordings isn't pulling up, but let me find the future like ours thing. Um, future like ours, abortion, PDF. I know if I just search up on here, it should like, I don't care. Oh wait, this might, is this it? Future like ours discriminate. Da da da. Is claimed by Future like ours argument that since killing adult humans is wrong because it deprives them of future value, and the fetus has a future value, killing the fetus is wrong because in the same way that killing adult humans is wrong. Da 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 da. That's like the most basic outline of the argument, and it's sort of like how do people like how using if just even a little bit of research you can be able to determine like you be able to determine like you'll be able to understand the core of the argument. And it's sort of like abortion arguments can go really complex. So for example, you can go into like your own theory of personal identity from an abortion argument, but typically if you are debating at like a tier 5 level, you won't really need to do this. Now again, it seems as if like for some odd reason I'm focusing too much on the pro-life sort of side, because mainly because like I'm pro-life and I mainly debate pro-life. But other arguments that I have seen for a pro-choice sort of side is like, oh well, there's no trait in the fetus that can value, right? Like, oh, this is the thing Falk said, right? Whenever I was debating him, and maybe other people may be more sympathetic to this sort of arguments. I'm just going to list off arguments that have been said against me, right? And maybe any of them may seem like sort of convincing to anyone who might be watching this video. So it's like, Folk says there's no sort of trait the fetus has that I can relate to, whereas I can relate to having a human conscious experience, right? So therefore, the humans have like more value, right? Because I can relate to them having a human conscious experience. However, and fetuses don't, because I can't relate to them because they don't have a human conscious experience. And like, I'm not going to explain why that's particularly stupid. I sort of went over it when I was debating him, right? But again, it's sort of like those sort of arguments. You can say that these people have a trait, and then the thing you want to do if you're arguing for something like prosentience is you don't want to argue in such a way in which it commits yourself to multiple reductio. So say for example, and this is the one that Mason used against folks whenever people start realizing who he was, right? Like Mason said, oh yeah, well, if there's a clone of your mother, she's never had sentience, right? Would it be fine for me to cut her up, grape her, like murder her, da 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 da? And it's like, well, obviously, no. Obviously, you wouldn't want, or obviously, you would say that it's still immoral to do that to your mother, even if she wasn't sentient, right? And she was never sentient. And it's like, okay, well, cool. So it seems as if, right, the thing you're morally valuing there, or the thing you're relating to there, can't just be, or it can't be human conscious experience, because if absent of that human conscious experience, right, you still seems as if that you can morally value them, but you also don't want to make it like make sort of arguments like, I know Smoothie does something like this too, so you make sort of arguments like, oh well, the reason why doing this to your mother is wrong is because you have an like emotional connection to your mother. It's like, okay, well, if the person you're debating also says, well, I have an emotional connection with the fetus, you as a pro-choice also need to figure out a way to actually get around those sort of arguments, because it's sort of like, if you want to be arguing, and this is why I personally think that arguing for pro-choice is much harder than pro-life, because arguing we don't value something is much harder than arguing, like at least from my perspective, is much harder than arguing we do value it. Because at least arguing we do value this thing would be, it's not as if you're taking away any of the traits that we already do value, but you're also adding another one onto the list of values. Whereas sort of if you're removing it, I don't know how to explain it, if you're removing a sort of trait that we value, right, and saying, or you're saying that there's this specific trait that we don't value, someone can give you all of these examples, and then you have to say, no, don't value that, don't value that, don't value that, don't value that, and then it may make you seem a little bit absurd, right? But this is like literally, if you search a feature like ours, like they immediately will tell you. So I'm pretty sure it's like Donald Marqueves. It's like, oh, I argue the right not to be killed does not entail infinite limited welfare rights. Da 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 da. But yeah, it just seems like deprivation of like a feature like ours is what makes it, right? Like there are a whole bunch of pro life arguments down here. It's like it deprives of fees. Like I don't understand how people have never actually bothered to just look up these sorts of arguments. It's like I don't really know. It's like, oh, this argument gets around any need to deal with the fetus as a potential person and to consider the rights of potential people. It's like people typically don't like considering potential arguments, and the reason why is because they say something like and I know Cinta probably has way better like pro-choice arguments than me, because maybe like I may not be the best person to do it. I'll probably get Cinta on the channel to explain a few, right? But again, literally for potential arguments, you just need to like, especially if you're like me and you're saying the fetus has potential, right? And therefore you value that potential. It's like you need to extremely get clear on what potential is, because potential can't just be logical possibility. Because if it's logical possibility, right, then it's like, okay, yeah, well, everything has potential, and if everything has potential, then you sort of don't want to bite the bullet that like that it's immoral to crush a rock, because obviously like people crush rocks all the time and it doesn't seem as if they're doing anything egregiously morally wrong. So what you want to do is get clear on like potential, and typically the way people use potential isn't something that's indexed to logical possibility. Because again, if I say, for example, and this is sort of examples that I've given to people like Ziza, right, it's like if I say I see potential in you to be a good basketball player, right? And I'm using that as a reason why I teach you. It's like, okay, well, potential clearly can't just be indexed to the fact that it's logically possible, because it's logically possible for my rock to become like the greatest basketball player ever, aka he just turns into LeBron James suddenly, right? And it's like, well, obviously that isn't how he's using potential there, because this sort of trait that he's picking out about you is also shared about like, or shared by many of these other things which he doesn't actually value, right? So it's sort of like, again, I don't really understand why people misinterpret the argument that way. So it can't be logical possibility. So it has to be something like, at least whenever people say potential, it just has to be probability like which is high. It doesn't have to be a specific number, but it needs to be high enough in which it's like in which is reasonable for you to take it into account. So obviously like well, probably not that, it's just like has to be a reasonably high probability. So obviously like you wouldn't say that like if something has a 1% probability of turning into a human conscious experience, right, or having a human conscious experience, that it'd be wrong for me to crush it, right? Because I'm sure like I'm sure there are just some rocks out there which suddenly, due to some like weird chemical interaction, they have a 1% chance of turning into people. But nobody would suddenly say that it's wrong for me to turn this rock into, or some for me to like crush this rock, right? So again, typically in applied ethics arguments, the main sort of thing you need to be focusing on is more so on the optics, more so on the rhetoric. It's like you can sort of focus on like trying to get to like, or trying to internally critique somebody else's view, but typically once you want to do that, it's like either A, point out how the sort of like semantics they're using for the argument seems to also entail absurd conclusions, or B, explain how explain how the argument sort of overgeneralizes, right? So for example, if somebody's argument is something like oh yeah, I only value X, and X is sort of a trait which is shared among multiple like entities, which everyone typically we act as if they do not have value, then only would you have to give an account of why we do not act as if they do not have value. But these other things which share the exact same trait, we act as if they do have value. What sort of distinction would there be? What sort of factor these people who are not valuing it as high as they quote unquote should, not sensitive to, right? You just need to, like, if you're debating somebody on applied ethics, you need to point out the fact that they're overgeneralizing. The second thing is, like, typically name the trait arguments are actually like really successful no matter what sort of domain you're going into. So if you're talking about like name the trait, for example, right, or if like you're debating abortion and they're like, hey, okay, so what sort of like trait within the mother, or within like a sentient, or within like a person, I should say, somebody who's outside the womb, right, and somebody who's inside the room, what sort of trait does that one who's outside the room have that makes you so that you value it, whereas like this one inside the room doesn't have, so which means that you don't value it? Or this other person, like, usually I've seen them more uprise with this, where they just bite the bullet that they do value the fetus, right, but they just value to a lesser extent than the mother. So since it's a lesser extent than the mother, then they would assign more value onto it. Or no, that they wouldn't they would say that it's still right to abort them because it's still right to abort them because, quote unquote, you should do what preserves more of like you should do what preserves more of what we value. That's what I've been told by certain debaters, and it's sort of like, then that sort of goes from an applied ethics argument to a normative ethics argument, where it's like, okay, well, why is the right action to do simply just the one which preserves more of what we value, right, instead of the action which would prefer, or which would preserve all of what we value, something like that. Or you could like sort of appeal to like practicality. For like, those are sort of like virtues that I have whenever I'm like looking over which sort of normative ethical view I should have. It's like, okay, well, is it practical? the sort of necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be good or bad, clear or unclear, right? If they are clear and unclear, right, then it's sort of like, okay, well, are the sort of actions that this normative view justifies, are they like are they absurd to me, right? This is sort of like a weak guideline that you should sort of follow whenever you're trying to pick out a normative ethical view. But again, it's sort of like to each their own. Arguing abortion isn't really that hard. Like if you're debating on a low level, it isn't really that hard. But if you're debating somebody who's really intelligent, it'll sort of get you thinking. And typically, I know a lot of people in the community don't really like doing the act of thinking. But hey, that's just it for me. Um, Hopefully, I see more competent pro-choice and pro-life debaters who, even though they aren't very good, they're still, you can note some potential inside of them. This has been Shinra, and I'm out in a bit.